Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our session on maximising the benefits of the UK Access Management Federation. My name is Rhys Smith and I lead the Trust and Identity group here at JISC. And today we're going to be talking about UK Access Management Federation. So first of all, I'm going to be setting a bit of context. So as you know, here at JISC, we believe technology has the potential to help the UK research and education sectors to solve our biggest challenges. Whether it's looking at open collaboration, digital resources, data and analytics, or enriching the student experience, technology can support us in helping navigate the rapidly changing present and future. And this is all critical to building a sector that's resilient to unforeseen changes, such as COVID-19, and absolutely critical in helping us transform and helping the sector transform as part of our vision for an education 4.0. So, technology. One of the technologies that JISC runs is the UK Access Management Federation. And I'm just going to go, we're going to look at the future by starting to talk about the past, as you do. Back in, God, almost 2 decades ago now, JISC was faced with a question. The question is, how do you create a single best practice solution for access to control, to web resources? This is way back when the web and digital resources were really starting to take off. Journal articles were starting to be consumed more digitally than going to physical buildings and looking through journal papers. And we had to solve a pretty fundamental challenge. As I said, how do we create a way of accessing control, of managing access control to web resources in a best practice solution? There are lots of variables that have to be taken into account when we were thinking about this question, because our membership has a very wide range of systems and services that everyone uses. So we have to make a way of managing this stuff, which is secure, vendor agnostic, based on open standards and interoperability. And then, just to make the question even more complicated, how do we solve this not just in the UK, but the rest of the world? Because with the growth of the internet and everything becoming digital, we're not an island anymore, and we weren't 20 years ago. So we need to work with our partners globally in designing such a solution if it was going to make an impact. So, enter the UK Access Management Federation. So, what is the UK Access Management Federation? So it's a service which JISC runs. It enables secure single sign-on between organizations, essentially. That's what it boils down to. It enables seamless digital access, improved security, gives organization control of their personal data, and all of that good stuff that people like, because it makes, at the end of the day, it makes end users, so students, staff, research, it makes their life easier because it gives you a single credential to use to access anything you need to access. And from an organizational perspective, gives you this greater control at the same time. So what is a federation to enable this? Some of you may not know. Largely, actually, the UK Access Management Federation is a trust framework. So it's not actually mostly technology, it's mostly a trust framework. And it's a trust framework that answers the question, how do we scale trust to allow literally thousands of organizations to collaborate in a secure, trustworthy manner with minimal upfront effort? So you don't technically need a federation for 2 organizations to be able to securely communicate, to do federated authentication between 2 organizations. You can do secure point-to-point federated authentication in a business-to-business kind of a way, but that requires work upfront for every single connection. You need to know there needs to be a certain amount of things in place for you to set up such a trusted connection between organizations. At the moment, as of yesterday, when we're recording this, there are around 2,500 entities in the UK Federation. And if you when we're talking about connecting through a service called EdgeAgain, which we use to connect to other such national research and education federations. So pretty much every country in the world has a federation similar to the UK Access Management Federation. We're one of the largest, but there are 80 or so connected through the service called EdgeAgain. That means there are something like 8,000 entities and therefore services available to end users. So doing the connection, the trust establishment between entities, between 8,000 services, is just not simply not possible. So what the UK Federation is a way of scaling the management of these interactions in a way that you don't lose trust and you don't compromise security, and you still get the benefits of federated authentication. So, as I said, it's a trust framework largely. It's a set of technical standards that enable global interoperability and a level playing field for vendors who want to provide services that connect to these to the UK Federation. Now, individual vendors don't necessarily like this, of course, because it stops them being able to lock you into their products and services. But this is, one of the things that JISC is here for, is to, as I said, provide a level playing field and global interoperability. And the way to achieve that is open standards and services which are able to be used by all of our membership, no matter what choices they make on an individual level about the technologies they deploy. So essentially, that's what the UK Access Management Federation is. And way back when, as I said, just over 2 decades ago, when we were trying to figure out what the solution should be, this is what we came up with. And this is not, we didn't come up with this on our own. We came up with this with our partners internationally. And hence, after 15 years, we're up to, as I said, something like 8,000 services or thereabout. So there's a little bit of context setting and background. So what we're going to be doing now is I'll be handing over shortly to Mark Williams, who is service manager for the UK Federation, for the UK Access Management Federation. And we'll be looking at how you can participate in the UK Federation, how JISC can support you in doing that. Once you're a member, what other things does that enable for you? And then we'll be passing over to John Agland, who is one of our technical leads, and he'll be talking about some technical best practice. And then finally, we'll be doing some Q&A at the end. So, Mark.
Thanks, Rhys. I'm Mark Williams from JISC, the UK Federation Manager. Well, as Rhys described, the Federation is a legal trust framework. It's a technical infrastructure, and it's a community of over 1,000 members and thousands of resources worldwide. But most importantly, it's a secure means of access to resources for both the provider and the patron. The end user will go to a resource, say Elsevier Science Direct, and they'll click on it, and at that point, they're directed back to their institutional login screen to authenticate to their institution. In the background, a set of attributes are sent about that user to the publisher, who then determines if they meet the requirements of the license. And hopefully, so essentially, this institution is saying, this is one of our users, we've got a license for this resource, and the service provider checks and says, yep, that's okay, that's cool, we'll let you in. The institution is vouching for its user. The service provider is trusting that assurance. What is not happening is that any PP, personal identifiable information, is actually being sent. The institution is saying, we know who this is, but we're not sending details. So it's completely anonymous. Those details can be sent later if the user consents, or in special cases where everyone concerned, the institution and the publisher, have signed up to the research and scholarship attribute, which is essentially a required implicit trust around collaborative research tools. And it's the SAML standard with its sophisticated attributes, staff, alumni, student, which allows granular access to be granted. So licenses can be more sophisticated and leveraged. Say an institution with a very small law department but a high overall cohort might be able to negotiate a smaller license because less users are using it. The technical side is all based around these SAML standards to enable everyone to talk to each other. Shibboleth, OpenAthens, these are just flavors. And although the JISC operates with Federation on behalf of the UK community, we don't care what flavor you use, just that they adhere to those standards. So, how to participate? Well, obviously, Shibboleth's the first option. JISC contributes to the funding of this open source code. We actually operate the Shibboleth Consortium on behalf of its members. And institutions and publishers can download that code and register it in the Federation for free. And I suspect if you're attending this event, this is something which might be, you certainly want to be considering, and it certainly provides the institution with the most flexibility and widest possible options. And the UK Federation Help Desk can certainly advise and support when you want to do this yourself. However, if you want to avoid that challenge, you could speak to JISC, and we have a trust and identity consultancy team who will use that same code and they'll deploy it for you. That is a chargeable service, but it certainly might save staff time in the long run. And also, partly because JISC has funded so many projects in this area, there are a number of third-party providers out there who have a lot of experience in Shibboleth. And again, you could choose and they could deploy Shibboleth for you. And the final option is OpenAthens, which is obviously also a JISC product. It has its own SAML compliant software, and it can be registered in the UK Federation. Personally, I really don't care what option you go for. I just want to see as many people connected as possible, get quotes, speak to everyone. There is no one-size-fits-all solution here. So just possibly, explore all those options and decide which one suits your institution. So that's the Federation. That's what it is. But how to participate and how to participate. But what can end users really do with it? Well, most of JISC resources and most of JISC access provision and licenses are predicated on using the Federation, such as v3 ebooks for FE service, and running an IdP is the essential way to get access to those and others. It's the entry-level requirement, really, an IdP in the Federation. And it will give your institution, it will give you access, a means of access to over 300 commercial resources in the UK Federation alone. And as Reese has mentioned, via EduGain, thousands worldwide. Another key service particularly for student enrichment, is the Verifid service. This is one where commercial discount providers like Shear and Unidays, etc., they provide discounted deals to students. They need to authenticate the student identity, and they've actually got an API which connects to a service provider in Federation called Verifid. So a student will just go to whatever they want the deal on, and instead of a verification having to take place, they've got to send proof of being part of an institution or something. Again, they're just verifying with their institution. It's completely anonymous. We just give the discount provider a yes or a no as to student status. One thing which is very important, though, is if you use SAML attributes correctly, to really be able to identify who is your student, but they're a student and not members of staff. And this allows our student discount providers to actually negotiate more favorable deals, because if they can say, we're only verifying a student cohort. Both Shibboleth and OpenAthens will allow you to do this for certain types of users. Defining the student attribute will also help end users and students use the student voter registration service. This is one where they log in again via the home institution, via federated access, and they can register to vote, and that information is sent to the councils. This is particularly important in England, where the Office of Students have made it supporting registering to vote by institutions a mandatory part of what they have to do. And personally, I think this is a really key service. It makes the flow much easier, makes it much easier for institutions to meet this need, but it really helps with increasing student democracy and their involvement. So please do get in touch if you want to know more, because I really think that this service can make a difference. And obviously, federated access is the means to over 100 just license deals and resources that they've negotiated, again, which we've managed to do for the entire community. So I think now John's going to take you on a much deeper technical dive into the UK Federation.
I'm John Agland, and I lead the technical team within Trust and Identity. My team are at the front line supporting the UK Federation, and also our consultancy service, which Mark has mentioned as well. Within the Federation, we have identity providers, and they are running SAML software. 65% of IdPs, or identity providers registered in the Federation, use the Shibboleth software. 30% use the OpenAthens software. Now, the Shibboleth software is open source. There's many ways to deploy and maintain that software. And we'll be talking a little bit about those aspects later on in this presentation. OpenAthens is a managed service, so you don't need to maintain the software. OpenAthens do that for you, but there may still be some considerations you want to take forward from these slides for users of that service. This is about IdPs directly registered in the UK Federation, so it's not including those in Edugain. That is separate. We don't have stats on those. So if you have an identity provider, you should maintain your identity provider. Shibboleth v4 is the latest and only supported version. That's, as of today, version 4.1.0. Within the Federation, we know we still have some v3 prevalent. It went unsupported at the end of last year, December 2020, and there's still about 3/4 of the Federation using that software. We're hopeful that most are planning to move forward with that, but we can talk a little bit more about the sort of upgrades on that. But version 2 has been unsupported since July 2016. So if your organization is running that software, you're in a pretty dire situation, and you want to look at getting some support urgently. SAML software is security software, so it should be maintained and updated. You should be regularly maintaining that and looking to update it when there's a security related patch or fix for it. There's lots of old versions out there. So we need to make sure that people are not using those old versions and moving forward. So the upgrade path for somebody on v3, an organization using v3 as their Shibboleth identity provider, you need to migrate to version 3.4.8. That's the very latest version and the last release for version 3. That contains a lot of deprecation warning messages that will indicate what you need to fix before you move to v4. You then need to move to 4.01. If you're following what the Shibboleth project wants you to do in terms of the upgrade path, you could, in theory, skip that and move forward straight to 4.1.0. But many organizations will be on 4.01, so it's a natural step to move through that, check that for deprecation warnings, and then move forward to 4.1.0. You will find most likely that during the upgrades to version 4 that you will need to either rehost or do significant updates to your system, particularly if you're running the Linux platform and managing the environment, so Java and the Java web containers such as Jetty or Tomcat yourselves. As 3.4.8 will run on Java 11, so whilst many will be using Java 8 probably, you can move to Java 11. We do have upgrade guidance on the UK Federation website. And one important point to note about this is that you should test your upgrade. So if you have test it on a copy of the IdP, check that it is actually doing what you think it should do before you go live with it. So earlier this year, earlier last year, sorry, April to July 2020, we did a significant amount of work with a group of identity providers who'd come to us and requested interest in having a health check of their IdP. And some of the findings from that are that, you know, the version 3 is still in use, and a lot of that is early version 3, so 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and not for 3.4. So there is still, you know, that upgrade path needs to be followed. Many need to upgrade Tomcat, Jetty, and Java as part of that process. Concerningly, there's still a lot of V1 and V1.1 of TLS in use. That this is not just about the Shibboleth identity provider. General web servers should also be checked for this. The recommendation now is that you should support TLS 1.2 if you can, and we've enabled that for a lot of the Federation services, because 99.9% of the services we were seeing were using TLS 1.2, so there wasn't a need for services, I mean user agents were using TLS 1.2. In some instances, IdPs were releasing personal information unnecessarily, and that's very important to look at. And this is where we sort of go on to the next point, really, around privacy and attributes and identifiers. So the recommended attributes to be sent by the IdPs in the Federation, this is the core set that you should release to everyone. And this is the edgy person targeted ID. That is a SAML2 persistent name identifier sent as a SAML attribute. That contains a pseudonym that is unique per user, per identity provider, and per service provider relationship. It needs all those things to stay constant. So it needs the identifier for the user to stay constant. That attribute is used widely in the Federation. And then the next one used is the edgy person scoped affiliation. So you should be sending separate staff and student affiliations. That's used by a lot of services. And as Marcus mentioned previously, the Verifid service is one of those. If you're using member, or just member on its own, then, or not using edgy person scoped affiliation at all, then please ask us for help, because we can help you ensure that your identity provider is providing that. And that will enable access to more services for your users. So moving on to another area that we deal with. So there's entity categories within the SAML federations, and there's lots of entity categories out there, but we're trying to work with certain entity categories. These are categories that describe a common criteria for different entities within the federation. So a set of identity providers might have a particular entity category, a set of service providers might have a particular entity category, and combinations of both might have a particular entity category. So the key entity categories for us are research and scholarship, which is about access to services for the research and scholarship sector and services in that area, so collaborative services such as wikis, but also, you know, it can be used by other things like research infrastructure. So there's a current version 1.3 of the standard that's a few years old now. So we are looking at version 2 of the standard, and there's a group within the community that is looking at that within the SAML Federations community, the ReFeds group, and they will be looking at moving forward with a new research and scholarship entity category. There's also an entity category for security incident response trust framework, and that covers just 4 areas of the identity provider provision that you have, and how you provide identity management within your organization. And it's just 5 pages long, but it's worth reviewing that and seeing if your organization could support that that entity category and the requirements of that entity category. So we are seeing that more service providers and more identity providers are requesting that each other use entity categories, and this is on the increase. So it's definitely worth being aware of these. So moving on to the next aspect of what we are dealing with within the Federation. So within the Federation, we require SAML encryption. Now, you may not understand what SAML encryption is. So let me just explain that very briefly, which is that if you have a service provider and an identity provider, and you are trying to communicate between those, and you are trying to send attributes and assertions about your users to a service provider, that goes through the user's browser. Now, hopefully, both ends are using TLS, and hopefully TLS 1.2, and therefore that conversation is protected, but it is visible within the browser. If you use SAML encryption, despite the two systems, the identity provider and the service provider, not having direct communications, it's all through the user's browser, there is SAML encryption, which means that that is encrypted end to end. Without it, then any third party that's in the middle, such as a browser or plugin, could see the attributes that are being sent. Any device performing SSL interception or TLS interception, that would also see it. And this could be the bad guys, we don't know. You're very much now dependent on the security of end user devices and browsers. So do you trust SSL TLS fully? And in this situation, we don't, and that is why SAML encryption is mandated within the Federation. If you don't support SAML encryption, you are 100% reliant on the SP doing signature checking correctly of the SAML assertion. If they are not doing that, then there be dragons, there's security incidents waiting to happen there. So encryption is a moving feast. It's not ever going to stop. We're not going to reach one encryption standard and stay there. We know it keeps moving, and we have to be able to move. And that is why there's a profile for algorithm support and algorithm agility within the Federation. There are RFCs that also talk about algorithm agility, and I've mentioned one of them there, RFC 7696. And if we look at the encryption algorithms that we are using, so CBC cipher block chaining was cracked in 2011, and therefore could be broken into potentially. So that is why we are now moving to GCM as the preferred minimum where we can. So IdP v4, the Shibboleth IdP v4 and the Shibboleth service provider software all support GCM. So what are we doing to help? So the CBC algorithm is and has been the SAML default for quite some time for encryption. So we have backfilled this to relevant SPs in the UK Federation metadata so that we can continue to interoperate, but enable identity providers to up their game to GCM. What we need to do as part of that is backfill through the SPs and find out which ones could support better than CBC. So it's now safe for IdPs to use GCM within the Federation. So if you have an identity provider in the Federation running either the late version 3.4 of the Shibboleth IdP or version 4, you can now make the changeover to the default using GCM. However, be aware of SPs which are bilateral, that are not in the Federation, that you are exchanging metadata directly with, because you will need to make sure that you've dealt with that situation. So cloud-based identity providers. We're seeing a lot more of cloud-based identity providers. Many organizations are following a cloud-first strategy, so that they're moving a lot of services into the cloud. And we've seen things over the years like email move in and collaborative services, and now we're seeing authentication move to the cloud. So cloud providers offer an identity provider that supports SAML in many instances. As a sweetener, many are also offering MFA, and that is hugely beneficial, particularly with the latest phishing and ransomware attacks. MFA is very, very important. So one of the common questions we get asked is, why does the UK Federation not work with our cloud provider? As Reese has mentioned earlier, we are vendor agnostic. We want to be interoperable. We are around open standards. So let's turn that around a little bit. Let's ask a different question. Let's ask, why does your cloud provider not support the Federation? What does it not support to work in the Federation? So Your cloud identity provider probably doesn't support SAML encryption by default. It may support it as a paid extra or a different tier within that product, but it doesn't support it unilaterally across this. If you run something like the Shibboleth software, it supports it by default. It's switched on by default. It doesn't have the ability to consume the Federation metadata. So there are two different publications that we offer in the Federation. We offer the full aggregate, a full 60 meg XML document as it stands today that your software can consume and work out which entities it needs to support. But we also support a more dynamic driven service, more DNS style, but it's served over HTTP, and that means that you can pull in the metadata for each entity as you require it, and the Shibboleth software supports that. Your cloud identity provider doesn't verify the signature of SAML metadata. So in most instances, they will take any SAML metadata you provide it and just ingest it without any checking as to its legitimacy. And they typically only accept that. They don't refresh that regularly. But also, if they don't verify the signature, that isn't compliant with our trust model. And the key point of the Federation is around trust. So if you are working outside of the trust model, you're not really in the game, and there's potential security risks for you not working within that. Typically, your cloud provider doesn't preserve user privacy. The default for sending these is often that they will send first name, last name, email address by default. That is not what we do in the Federation. We want to preserve privacy by default. You don't send that by default. You send that if people meet your various requirements. I talked about entity categories earlier. That's one of the things that often is used as a leveler to move up and send more attributes. Your cloud provider doesn't support the edgy person schema. So the edgy person schema is used predominantly, the core scheme used for sending attributes and data about users within the Federation is the edgy person schema. We don't see that supported within these cloud providers. And then lastly, they don't typically allow you to configure the entity ID. So the entity ID is based on components and domains that relate to that organization, and you can't change that at all. So it is a form of vendor lock-in, and it's very important that organizations don't get caught into vendor lock-in, and so we are trying to support people without getting locked in by these vendors. So let's talk about what the solution is. So how do we sort of deal with this problem? So in Shibboleth IdP v4, we now have SAML proxying support. It is offered natively within Shibboleth IdP v4. You won't need any extra components. That means it differs very greatly from what may have happened in v3. So if your knowledge of the Shibboleth product is based around v3, you may have some preconceived ideas that it requires things like LDAP or a database, or that you have to host it on site. SAML Proxying frees us from all of those things, assuming you can get all of your attributes from your other SAML identity provider. So whether that's your cloud-based provider or whether that's another SAML identity provider that you have on site. And we are very supportive of this because this offers a full single sign-on experience for end users. And it's worth noting that OpenAthens have very similar support and have had this support for quite some time for SAML proxying through something called connections within their product. So this isn't new. It is new to the Shibboleth product, and is very much there. And my team, through the Federation and through the Trust and Identity Consultancy particularly, have seen a significant uptake in SAML proxying as the method to do this. And less and less people are now using LDAP as the method. So this diagram briefly explains how this all works. So if you follow the steps, you've got steps 1 through to 8, and you can see that if a user goes off to service provider, goes to log in at that service provider. I've skipped the discovery aspect here just to make this easier. But if they go off there, they go to their Shibboleth identity provider, and that that is typically, so the user goes off to the service provider, then they come back to the Shibboleth identity provider with an authn request. That Shibboleth identity provider simply offers another authn request out to the next identity provider. That then does whatever it needs to do, getting the data from the directory, and then moves over to sending an assertion and a SAML response to the Shibboleth identity provider. That then does whatever it needs to do inside to retranslate that, hopefully removing some of the personal information we've just received, and then sending out the pseudonyms and the affiliations out in the SAML response and assertion in step 7. And then step 8 is that the user is gained access. But this is all transparent to the user. They simply see that they go to a service provider and they're presented with a login page. They don't see all these redirects that take place in that process. So how can you get ongoing support for your IDP? So there is a dedicated help desk run out of Trust and Identity. My team are the primary support for that service. And we support lots of organizations through the service desk for free. And if you are happy to deal with us on an email basis, then we will provide you as much help as we can. If you require more hands-on support, or you want us to deliver something for you to a particular timescale, discuss your requirements around what you want to do, and maybe provide ongoing support, then consultancy with the retained expertise is how we would do that. And we are seeing a lot of organizations taking that. And similar to this, OpenAthens offer a managed service in this area. So they offer a whole suite of identity products and products that enable access to services. And those identity providers can and should be registered in the UK Federation, and they can interoperate in the Federation just the same as any other entity there. So within JISC, we also have a training division, and we have training courses for Shibboleth IdP and SP, which we are working on updating at the moment. If you don't want to come to JISC for this, there are lots of third parties out there. And we list a list of third parties, and we've worked with many of these third parties ourselves through the Federation Service Desk. So don't just come to JISC. We want you in the Federation. If you want to go with the third party, that's fine. Just do that. But please come to the Federation and use the Federation. There is a whole community around the Shibboleth software, and there are user lists and discussion lists around that many in the community are using, and they're an excellent way to get support. And you'll find that myself, my team, use those lists, both reading them and also participating in some of the discussions there. But you can also support the Shibboleth consortium. So open source is open source. It is free software, but that software has to be paid for by somebody. And you can also gain extra support through the consortium and extra input into the direction of the Shibboleth product. And that is one reason why you might join the consortium. So the last area I want to talk to you about, which is just about unique identifiers, and we talked about the EduPerson targeted ID, and whilst that is in daily use and you will need to support that to operate in the Federation, standards proliferate. We move on. There's always a new connector or whatever. In this case, we have the subject identifiers. There is a new standard for the subject identifiers. Has been put together. That was published in 2019. We will gradually need to move away from EduPerson targeted ID, but it is a long path. So the question is it time to start enabling this? And we would like to have some user focus groups in later this year to discuss that with organizations and technical staff within those organizations. So I think at this point, I'll hand over to Reese.
Right, hello again, back to me. So thanks to Mark and John for sharing their thoughts on the UK Access Management Federation. It's as difficult for us to say that it is for you. So just to recap a little bit, we all know staff and student experience is absolutely key in today's competitive and increasingly flexible environment. And from an organizational perspective, managing control of your data and improving the security of authentication is a kind of key operational requirement, especially in today's world of phishing and ransomware. So what we've looked at today is the UK Federation and how that's a key service helping you guys, all of our membership and beyond, collaborate securely, flexibly, and with minimal effort. It's basically a classic shared service. We do many of the things required to establish trust so that every member doesn't have to do it for themselves several thousand times potentially, and every organization doing the same thing over and over again. So it's all about saving effort within the community and making things easier. And yeah, so all good. And once you've done it, make sure you take advantage of all of the other benefits that become available to you. So things like Verifid and whatnot that Mark has spoken about. So I think at that point, we will take some questions.